They left him in there. Okay. Coochie. You said. Except today. Well, they scored 3 runs off of him to take the lead. But they were unearned. So it wasn't his fault.
All right, good evening. Ready to get started? You ready? I've already started streaming, so what you're saying is being recorded. Good evening. All right, so we are in Daniel chapter 5 tonight. Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 31. Let me start with a word of prayer, if that's all right. Dear Father, we come around tonight just to your word, and again for you to speak to us through your Holy Spirit to be our teacher. Father, to convict us where we need to be convicted, to lead us into truth where we've not had it or where we've not been living in it, to bring about change where we need to be changed, to bring about more of a strength to our conviction and a strength to our walk where we need it, and just to be have an understanding and a broadening of our sense of your word and your activity throughout history, to affirm our belief in that the Bible is true and accurate and can withstand any attack upon it. And I pray, Father, just for an openness and a sense of ready to be learning from your Spirit tonight. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So I'm assuming I'm on. Luis, you checked it? I'm on. All right. All right, so here we go. As a reminder, I gave you the timeline, but I expanded it a bit. I added a few details that will be pertinent to our study of Daniel 5. So that really kind of gets in about 562 BC. You know, up until this point, we've been looking at Nebuchadnezzar. He was kind of the king of choice through the first 4 chapters. And then here in chapter 5, he's no longer on the scene. It's Belshazzar, which is, I think, how to say that, according to my little book that tells me how to say it. So in 562 BC, Nebuchadnezzar dies. And then there's an interval of several different kings, several different people in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And so that's where it gets a little dicey and a little hard to comprehend. So I tried to make it as clear as I could. So if you look in there at 562 BC, Nebuchadnezzar dies. That's after his time of madness, after his time of becoming like a beast. And then he's succeeded by his son, Amel-Marduk. And you may have seen that as evil Merodach. That may be a way that you've seen that printed. But Marduk, is a Babylonian god. That was one of their chief gods in their pantheon. But Amel-Marduk was assassinated 2 years later by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. And I may not be saying that right. I didn't do the pronunciation on that one, but Neriglissar, maybe is how you say it. His brother-in-law, Merodach's brother-in-law, assassinates him. And so in about 560 BC, and I left these numbers kind of broad, there could be some, remember those ascension year things, so there could be some of those at play in the timing of these. But along about 560, Neriglissar reigned 4 years, succeeded by his son, Labrador, I don't know, however we say that, Laborossoarkod. And he was assassinated shortly after taking the throne. He didn't last very long. And so roughly 556 BC, a guy named Nabonidus takes the throne. Now he's not in direct succession. He's not in the line of Nebuchadnezzar. He's not in the family tree. But he does a smart thing. He's part of the plot to remove Labrador. It's part of the plot to remove him. And he gets himself in line for the succession by marrying one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, or perhaps Nebuchadnezzar's widow. We're not sure about which one. It was either his daughter, one of his daughters, or Nebuchadnezzar's widow. We're not sure. So he has inserted himself into the line of succession, and he assumes the throne in 556. Well, in 553 BC, Belshazzar, who is the son of the daughter or the widow of Nebuchadnezzar that Nabonidus married. So we assume that Belshazzar was an existing child. He's not Nabonidus' son. He's a stepson, if you will. Belshazzar begins to reign as a co-regent of Babylon. Nabonidus is in a self-imposed exile in Arabia. And there, in the meantime, there's a whole lot of things going on with Babylon. The Medes and Persians are on the warpath. They're starting to make inroads into the different areas around, and they're making threats against Babylon. And so Nabonidus, maybe being the smarter of the two, decides, well, I think I'll go hang out in Arabia and just kind of be safe there and let the chips fall where they may. And so he leaves Belshazzar, who there's no definitive place in history that I could find where we find out about his age, but I assume that he's much younger than Nabonidus. So I don't know if that means he was a teenager or 18. We don't know. All that we could find is that he's younger. And so he is left now as the co-regent of Babylon. Now, all this is taking place behind the scenes between chapter 4 and chapter 5, and there's not a mention of all this going on. But, and I'll mention this again, but when we get into chapter 7 and chapter 8 of Daniel, that'll be a flashback. Those visions that Daniel gets in 7 and 8 are a flashback to during the time span of the reign of Belshazzar. So it's almost, this is the end of Belshazzar's reign here in chapter 5, but 7 and 8 will be a visions that Daniel has during the reign of Belshazzar. Does that make sense? Okay. So now Belshazzar's reigning, and so this feast here, as we come to chapter 5, is taking place, and this is where scholars, they're sure of this one. They can nail it down to even the month of the year of 539 BC, and part of that is because of the way the Medes and Persians kept records. And we know that their reign, that Babylon fell and the Medes and Persians took over in 539 BC. That much we know. October is when they put, so almost about this time of year. Spooky. 539. So then 538, and again, ascension years, we don't know if it's immediate or how much time passed in between. It seems like from the text of Daniel 5, as we'll see, that it seems to be immediate, that Darius the Mede takes over in Babylon. There could have been some time there, because remember, Darius is a regional, he's a provincial leader. He's not a king. Cyrus is the king of the Medes and Persians, and he puts Darius in a place in Babylon as the figurehead for Babylon. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions about that?
Is Darius what origin? If he's a provisional?
Yeah, he would be Medo-Persian. I don't know specifically from where, but he was already involved in that kingdom or in that empire, and so from that empire he took him and placed him in Babylon. That's a good question, Richard. I don't know. I didn't find anything about that, but I didn't read the secular history of things. But who knows if Darius was not the leader on the ground during the siege of Babylon that night during this feast. I don't know. Good question. All right. So then, one more thing to point out before we get into this. Notice when 605 BC. That's when Jerusalem is taken by Nebuchadnezzar, right? And we figured that Daniel was a teenager at that time, maybe somewhere in the age of 16, 18, maybe a little younger. So notice the time span now. We've arrived at, 66 years? So add 66 to 16, 82. That's how old Daniel is at this time. So in 539. 539. So keep that in mind, that Daniel's not the young teenager anymore, the young buck that he was. He's aged some. He's got some years on him. All right, so that's important. It'll be particularly important when we look at. I don't know if you imagined him as a senior adult in the lion's den next week, but sure enough, he was. Okay, so from this timeline, we know that Daniel 4 ended with Nebuchadnezzar retelling of his time as a beast. He retells that time, and so he comes out of that. So maybe there was some time was spent reigning after he had come out of that mental illness or that imposed illness that God gave him. So we're not sure about that. So at least, I would say at least 30 years have passed, if not 23 to 30 years have passed between Daniel chapter 4 and Daniel chapter 5. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Okay, page 2. So at this point, the Babylonian Empire is in its final days, something that the prophet Isaiah had foretold. We've looked at some passages from Isaiah. This is from Isaiah 14:22, and according to the chronological Bible that I found, this was written by Isaiah, the Lord's instruction to Isaiah, the Lord's words, in 713 BC. So this is 180 years, 170 years before that Isaiah writes this. Declares the Lord here, I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts. By the way, the Lord of hosts is that kind of warrior name of God. It's that powerful kingdom name of God that he calls himself, the Lord of hosts. And will cut off from Babylon name and survivors, offspring and prosperity, declares the Lord. So, whatever the math is between 713 and 539, back in 713, God told Isaiah that that's what he was going to do. So this is no surprise that this is happening. Then earlier than that, in Isaiah 13, behold, I'm going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold. That's interesting because of what Belshazzar does with the items of the temple, which we'll get to. Verse 18, and their bows will mow down the young men. They will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor will their eye pity children. That's in Isaiah 13. Again, about specifically the Medes being the one that brings a defeat to Babylon. God knew this way ahead of time, right? This is history unfolds, and we think it unfolds in the choices of men, but God is the one who knows all things, right? Jeremiah 51, verses 1 and 2, verse 11 and verse 28. And this was in 650 to 570 BC, so a little bit more recent time, but still in the past. Thus says the Lord, behold, I'm going to arouse against Babylon and against the inhabitants of Leb-Kamai, that's Chaldea, the spirit of a destroyer. I will dispatch foreigners to Babylon, that they may winnow her and may devastate her land. For on every side they will be opposed to her in the day of her calamity. Sharpen the arrows, fill the quivers. The Lord has aroused the spirit of the kings of the Medes, because his purpose is against Babylon to destroy it. For it is vengeance of the Lord, vengeance for his temple. Interesting, vengeance for his temple. Again, with the instruments, the cups. We'll read about those in just a minute. Verse 28, consecrate the nations against her, the kings of the Medes, their governors and all their prefects in every land of their dominion. So this has already been set in motion. The Lord already knows what's going to happen here. And so now we come to chapter 5, finally. At the end of page 2, we come to verse 1, Belshazzar's great banquet. Let me read verses 1 through 9. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels, there they are, which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. And the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. And the king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read the inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. All right. During the days and months preceding chapter 5, The kingdom of the Medes and Persians have made advances toward conquering Babylon. In fact, most historians believe that by this point, we get to chapter 5, Nabonidus has already been defeated, captured, and exiled to a place called Carmania. And that's not like a new name for Carmax, but just somewhere that's away from Babylon. Now, remember from session 1, the city of Babylon was well fortified. This is an important time to remember that. Walls surrounded the city 350 feet high, right? If you can imagine. Remember the statue was, 90 feet high, so this is 350 feet high. So take that image of the statue that we looked at and multiply it almost by 4. Walls also lined the river on either side, and 150 gates of solid brass protected the entrances. On the wall were some 250 watchtowers, 100 feet higher than the wall itself. The outside wall had a deep water moat, some 30 feet wide. Belshazzar thought he would be perfectly safe from any attack inside his well-fortified city. He thought, nobody can get me in here. I'm just fine. We've got the river running through. We got enough water. We got provisions. We got it made. No problem. John MacArthur writes about these kinds of feats, and I'll let your kind of imagination roll along with this. But the Persian monarchs, he said, we know from archaeological discovery, were known to dine daily with 15,000 guests at a meal. Now, that's a lot of folks, MacArthur says. When Alexander the Great, he had 10,000 people come to his marriage dinner. You think that's something? And I won't try to pronounce Ashurnasirpal. In 879 BC, archaeologists tell us through a banquet including 69,754 guests. And the food, you can't believe it. Describing the dinners of the Persians, Athanasius says in one passage, 1,000 animals are slaughtered daily for the king. These comprise horses, camels, oxen, asses, deer, and most of the smaller animals. Many birds are consumed, including Arabian ostriches, geese, and chickens. And MacArthur says, they really went for the food, and so he throws a feast. So this is just a little glimpse, and it's not about the food. Also, it's not only about the food, because you heard me read in here about the king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines. It's also a scene of gross debauchery. And, think of whatever kind of show you've watched that kind of looks like these. It's of the worst kind that you could imagine going on. So don't let your imagination run too far, but up to a point where you understand just the kind of just the kind of feast that's being thrown here. Now in verse 2 and 3, he gives orders to bring the gold and silver vessels. These are the ones from Daniel chapter 1, verse 2, Daniel makes a point, or the author makes a point of making sure that we know that Nebuchadnezzar had taken those out of the temple at Jerusalem. And those are sacred things. And when we get into talking about these, I know they're items, they're vessels, but we're talking about the concept of sacred space, that these belong to God. These are His. And for those to be used for any other purpose except what they were intended for is to be idolatry and a vehement command not to be used for anything. Look at Jeremiah 51:7. This is in that same chapter of what I quoted before, but look at how Jeremiah describes it, or the Lord does through Jeremiah. Babylon has been a golden cup in the hand of the Lord, intoxicating all the earth. The nations have drunk of her wine, therefore the nations are going mad. Now remember, God is the one who sets kings in place, and I believe for the reason He allowed Babylon to come into power and to take that place was because because God's people, Judah at that point, failed to be obedient to the Lord. They failed to worship Him as the one true and living God. They held to idols. They went their own way instead of God's way. And so part of their chastisement or their discipline was God allowing them to be taken captive by the Babylonians. God put that in place. If that sounds harsh, God disciplines those He loves, Hebrews, right? So it's ironic, though, this statement. Look at what Jeremiah said. Babylon has been a golden cup in the hand of the Lord. I don't know if you catch the irony here, but this golden vessel, these golden cups were in the temple. They were in the place where God was worshipped, and they were used for drink offerings and libations, and they were used as holy things. And yet here Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes them. But the very fact that Nebuchadnezzar has taken Judah and gained power is only by God's hand, and it's as if he has given that cup into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Do you see the irony there that's at play? So yet here, at least 30 years before this feast of Belshazzar, the Lord declares that he is holding Babylon like a cup in his hand. Now, I think that's also an allusion, not illusion with an I, but allusion with an a nod to the temple, given Belshazzar's flippant use of the temple vessels. And as we've seen throughout the Old Testament, God takes the items used in worship of him very seriously. And I just pointed to a couple. Sons of Korah in Numbers 16, that they wanted to handle the holy things, and they said, why did the sons of Aaron get to touch those things and we don't? And so they argued against the Lord, and the Lord opened up the ground, and into Sheol they went. In 2 Samuel 6, Uzzah touches the Ark of the Covenant and is immediately struck dead. Right? So God takes this very seriously. He's not playing with Belshazzar taking this aim at using these cups. Verse 4, they drank the wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Most scholars believe that these were the created or crafted idols. That not only did they have this worship, this feast going on, but as a part of this feast was idol worship. And they had these images, these carved and crafted things of, and notice it goes from most valuable to least valuable: gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. All these different representations of the gods of Babylon's pantheon. Verse 5, then suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing. Wow, this nowhere else in Scripture this happens, right? Nowhere else. This is the only place in Scripture. Now there's the finger of God, I'll get to in a minute, finger of God that writes the commandments on the tablets, but not in front of a pagan nation. Only time. John MacArthur writes, we'll get ahead. This is nothing short of a miraculous and powerful display of Yahweh. This is. I don't believe that this is figurative. I don't think it's symbolic. I think this actually happened. And it's to get the attention of Belshazzar amidst the rumblings of the great feast. And so I wrote to you here, could this be the same fingers that inscribed the Ten Commandments? That's in Exodus 31:18, which I think would be the fingers of Christ, second person of the Godhead. But anyway. So then opposite, the Scripture makes a point of giving some detail. Opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Wow, such detail there. But look at what MacArthur writes. He said, lampstands were usually placed for the lighting, the brightest lighting, at the point where the king sat, because he was the crown of the occasion. It was very likely that as the king sat with the lampstand in his presence, right over his head, those fingers wrote across that plaster wall supernaturally. And I'll just add in here too, lampstand is also a nod to the temple, right? There's a lampstand in the holy place. So that's also a nod to it. Then MacArthur goes on. The archaeologist Coldway, who excavated Babylon, says that in their excavation of the palace of Babylon from the time of Belshazzar, they have found in the palace a large room 55 feet wide, 169 feet long, and it had, said Coldway, it had plaster walls. Isn't that amazing? Just what the Bible said, wrote on the plaster. And the place they found had plaster walls. And it also had, said the archaeologist, a niche in one wall, where they believe the king sat elevated and with a niche in the wall so he would be central. So then there's the detail still in verse 5 that the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. The word back is, in the Hebrew, it's the palm. So apparently it's as if kind of he's writing and the king is looking and he can see the palm of the hand. So it's as much of, he sees more than just the finger, it's as much of the hand described there. Now verse 6, you get your mind around, this is a comedy of comedies in verse 6. It's meant to be this way. The king's face grew pale. Literally, the king's brightness changed from him. The merriment of the feast quickly turned to fear. Then it says, his thoughts alarmed him. We've seen that before. Alarmed being the word applied to Nebuchadnezzar several times in some of the other passages on several occasions, Nebuchadnezzar. But then here's the funny one. His hip joints went slack. It's not what you might think. Now, literally, the knots of his loins were loosed. He lost control of his bowels. Some scholars say that means he either collapsed or lost control of his bowels. But literally, in the Hebrew, it's the knots of his loins were loosed, and he lost that. Now, we'll also see this again in verse 12, but we'll get to that later. And then it says his knees began knocking together, and you know that's typically portrayed. I think about the image that comes to mind for me is just how weird I am, is the old Charlie Chan movies. Remember the chauffeur, Charlie Chan's chauffeur? He was always afraid of everything. You know, he had the big eyes that open like that, and he's always, like, knees are knocking, he's always shaking. That's what comes to mind when I think about that, but that's just me. So notice the description of what happens to him flows from head down to knees. It's describing, it's almost as if this is happening to Belshazzar's body moving from north to south, right? So in verse 7, here again, the typical call to the wise guys is made. This time Belshazzar called aloud, though. The last times that we've seen this happen, Nebuchadnezzar would send a proclamation, or he'd send an order for the wise men to come. Well, here he cries aloud. It's intense. It's almost like a scream. Now, it's understood that the hand had left behind a message or an inscription. And so Belshazzar now makes a hefty promise. He says that the one who interprets this will be clothed with purple and given a necklace of gold, both symbols of royal authority. Now, I don't know, anybody watch The Voice besides me? Anybody watching The Voice with Snoop Dogg? No? Thank you, Susan. Somebody is. Snoop Dogg now, if somebody gets on his team, he brings them a necklace and puts it on him. You know, that's how my mind works. I don't know. It's just weird. But this symbol of royal authority. And to become the third ruler in the kingdom. That's interesting, third ruler. It's not weird, though, if you think about that Nabonidus is in Arabia and Belshazzar's the co-regent in Babylon. So now there's the two, and now he's giving equal footing to whoever interprets this dream. It's a significant reward that he's giving out. Now, verse 8, as we've become accustomed to, these wise guys aren't so wise. They're unable to help. It's almost like it becomes comical at some point, you know, that here they come again, stumbling in. No, we don't know. Yeah, they're just of no help at all. Some scholars believe the inscription was only visible to the king and to Daniel. I'm not sure about that. I don't think so. I think it was visible to everyone. It's just they couldn't interpret it. They didn't have the way to interpret it. Others believe it was not typical Aramaic text or any other known language. But we'll see in a minute when we get to Daniel's interpretation. We'll see how clear it was to him.
But they could all see the hand, right?
That's a question too. The scholars are divided on their opinion of that. I think so. I don't think it's him alone. I think it's just the action centers around Belshazzar. He's the one responsible, but I think everybody could see it. I think. So the verse 9, the wise men's inability to interpret the writing caused further alarm, and his face grew even paler. All right. So now the second section here, verses 10 through 12, the queen's speech. Verses 10 through 12. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation." All right, a lot here to this. Almost every scholar, virtually every scholar, agrees that this is not Belshazzar's wife. This is the queen mother, the dowager, the Maggie Smith of Downton Abbey of the. Anybody watch Downton Abbey? No? Am I the only one that watches TV in here? Maybe I watch too much TV. Thank you again, Susan. Maybe I watch too much TV. All right. So they think that this is most likely, this is the wife of Nabonidus, who would also could be a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, right? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Writing on the wall.
The queen, exactly. So the queen mother was viewed with importance in the royal courts of the ancient Near East. So again, I said think Maggie Smith as in Downton Abbey. My my opinion, for what it's worth, now my opinion may not mean as much to you after you see how much TV I watch, but my opinion is that the word of the alarm of Belshazzar had reached her, and she was not participating in the feast. And that's I've read several accounts of that. It would be custom for this to be kind of beneath her dignity, the Queen Mother, that she would be in another part of the palace, but somehow the word has spread to this point of, you might want to go see what's going on in there, that kind of thing. So she says, first thing she says, "O King, live forever." She's not being disrespectful. That's the typical standard court etiquette for her to say, but it's ironic because that very night Belshazzar would die, so he didn't. And then she gives the description. She says, "There's a man in your kingdom." Now, the whole point that she's having to explain this either explains how out of touch Belshazzar was, or, and I think this is the case, that something else happened with Daniel after Nebuchadnezzar's reign was over. When Nabonidus and all these other kings, with all the infighting and all of that, and eventually Nabonidus, Daniel probably has now his title's probably been removed from him. He may still be involved somehow with the wise guys, but he's not head honcho in charge anymore, probably because of the succession of the kings here. So he's not in with the elite that gets invited to the feast. Not that he would participate anyway. So this is the same description given to Daniel by Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4:18. The Queen Mother describes Daniel the same way that Nebuchadnezzar did in 4:18. Now, she says, "In the days of your father." Now, we shouldn't let the word father there confuse us as to his lineage, because John MacArthur points out there is no word for grandfather in the Hebrew. So if there's a grandfather situation, they would say your father's father. There's not a word for G-pop in the Hebrew. So don't be confused when the Queen Mother calls Nebuchadnezzar Belshazzar's father. It just simply means ancestor, forefather, if you will. So she repeats the phrase, your father, and a couple of scholars that I read believe that that's a jab to Belshazzar, that is as if he's not fit for the throne of Nebuchadnezzar. Because she meant, just think about it this way, if she says it, in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, remember, it's just almost a jab to the fact that Belshazzar really not cutting the mustard, if you will. Then she says, appointed him. And there in the last part of verse 11, the king appointed him chief of the magicians. Apparently, Hebrew language tells us here that Daniel's no longer in that position because that's in the past tense, but also that the Queen Mother seems to have to inform Belshazzar of his existence. And so, like I said, it's likely that after Nebuchadnezzar's death, amidst of many changes, Daniel was removed from that position. Nevertheless, his reputation precedes him, right? It's verse 12. And she goes on, "This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in him." Solving of difficult problems. If you looked in the Hebrew for that, it's the same words that were found in verse 6. The ones that said that his bowels were loosened. Same word. Same words there. So it's possible that this was also a jab at Belshazzar. You have to use your imagination here, but it's as if the Queen Mother's come in, and if she's the dowager, if she's got the high and mighty kind of, and she's looking over at Belshazzar, he was able to solve difficult problems like that, as if to point to his state of being, I'll go with that. So I'll stop there. But literally, the word there for solving difficult problems is loosening knots, is the word. So some scholars think it's wordplay there that she's using. Okay, let Daniel now be summoned. The queen gives Belshazzar really no choice now. She's and she holds that kind of authority and that kind of position, that she's basically issued a command that he be brought forward. So really, that can't be ignored. Belshazzar can't refuse at that point. So now they got to go find Daniel and bring him in. Okay, that leads to the third section. Before I go on, any questions, comments?
She is related to him genetically.
Don't know. I think so. Yeah, that's a good question. Betsy said she is related to him genetically. By him, you mean Belshazzar?
Yes.
I think so. I think so, but I can't be 100% sure.
Because, I mean, if she's insulting him kind of in front of people,
Yeah.
I mean, if it's his own mother doing it, I think he would be a lot less likely to act badly, yes. thank
Yeah,
you.
it's either his mother or his aunt.
Okay.
Yeah, one of those two. Lonnie?
So, actually, if we think about it, Belshazzar's 23. He wouldn't really, because it's been 23 years since Nebuchadnezzar died. So, if he was
Yeah.
a young man, he might not really know.
That's true. Yeah, that's possible. Highly possible. Lonnie said that if it's been 23 years since Nebuchadnezzar died, maybe Belshazzar's just somewhere in that. He was born toward the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and maybe he doesn't know. That's possible.
Do they have it the same as just, I guess, how a normal kingdom would have it? Like, oh, you're the first oldest son, you're going to take the throne? Or, because,
Yeah.
he probably had a lot of women.
I think so. I think it was the firstborn, but then, as we've seen, there were so many different assassinations and changes, of hand there in between this time, that it's probably that Belshazzar may be the only one left alive. Or maybe in that line of succession after Amon Marduk was killed, and after several that were killed in between. So he may just be further down the list. But yeah, I think they did have that older. The oldest was the next in line, that line of ascension.
Did they have it, so he would have had like concubines, and there would be, I guess you consider it like first wives / this is the queen, everybody else is a little bit below her, all my other women.
Yeah, I would.
It would come from her lineage, or whoever was born male first.
Yeah.
Out of all the concubines.
So firstborn male was always that was really the thing. Didn't really matter if it was the queen or a concubine, but firstborn male was at least in the Hebrew culture, that was for sure. I guess I'm kind of assuming in the Babylonian culture, I'm not 100% sure, but firstborn male was usually the one that it passed to. But there's always exceptions along the way, depending on how those children behaved and how they presented themselves for leadership, and so it's a tangled web. Lines of succession are. Ishmael, yeah. Even in the lines of Hebrew, there's the older shall serve the younger. Ishmael was really the firstborn son to Abraham through a concubine, but Isaac was the child of the promise. So it's not. I don't think it's hard and fast. But good question. Okay, let's look at verses 13 through 16. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I've heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you." I just got to stop and say that this almost like it's kind of icky. It's like a car salesman. I'm sorry, if you're a car salesman, I don't mean that in the wrong way. Sorry. Sometimes I let my mouth overload my mind. But you know how it's just it's kind of false flattery. Now I've heard that you are, and he does verbatim what the Queen Mother said. And I imagine the Queen Mother standing there, and it's just a little icky to me here. I'm sorry about the car. I didn't mean the car salesman thing. I'm sorry. Eddie Haskell, thank you. There we go. Eddie Haskell, from Leave It to Beaver? Yeah, exactly. Haskellish. Eddie Haskellish, yes. If you don't know Leave It to Beaver, it was a series. It was in black and white. Got to explain for the younger viewers. For our younger viewers. Okay, sorry. That's why I should not stop and comment and just stick to the notes. Okay, where did I leave off? Okay. Verse 15. Now just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, again, that you're able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Loose knots. Now, if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you'll be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you'll have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Same thing he said to the other guys. Verse 17, Daniel answered, said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself. Now, I will stop and say this. Again, Daniel's a little bit more seasoned than he was as a teenager. Sometimes that seasoning earns you the right to say some things that you can't when you're younger. Am I right? Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, y'all know it. Yeah. So then keep your gifts for yourself, give your awards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription of the king and make the interpretation known to him. Verse 18, O king, the most high God, granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed. And whomever he wished, he spared alive. And whomever he wished, he elevated. And whomever he wished, he humbled. Now, I'm probably going to rehash notes here, but just to say, make sure that you understand that what Daniel's saying, he's not saying that was necessarily a right thing to do, but he's saying that God is the one who placed that authority in Nebuchadnezzar, is what he's saying. Okay. To make sure I clear that up. Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up, and that's not meant to be, my heart was lifted by the heartwarming story I saw on Hallmark Movie Channel. No, it's not that. It's proud, it's pride, it's arrogance. When his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. It's God who gives and God who takes away. He was also driven away from mankind. His heart was made like that of beasts. His dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he recognized the Most High God as ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Now that Lonnie, makes me think that he was around longer. I didn't think about that earlier. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. Told you those are important. And you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines, have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand, but the God in whose hand are your life breath, and all your ways you have not glorified. Wow. Okay, so Daniel does not address the king in the customary manner like the queen mother did. He goes right into, no, you can keep your gifts. That's the first thing he says to him, as far as we know. Because, a couple of reasons, because he wants his interpretation to remain free from any sense of coercion or bribery. He doesn't want his interpretation to be tied to what he might get, so he refuses. But he promises to read the inscription. Now, verse 18 and 19, Daniel recounts the greatness and the sense of power and authority of Nebuchadnezzar, that he could act as his heart desired. His heart was lifted up. He points out the arrogance and proud nature. Verse 21, he recalled the years of madness. Daniel's point in verse 20 and 21 was to reinforce that Yahweh, the Most High, is ruler over mankind, sets over the people whom he wishes. And then Daniel turns his attention to Belshazzar in verse 22. Yet you, his son. Again, son is not to be taken literally, but should instead meant to be understood as descendant. Daniel implies that Belshazzar had enough information to have learned from Nebuchadnezzar's mistakes. Verse 23, you've exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. This is a serious accusation. However, at this point, Daniel has seen rulers come and go. He's seen Nebuchadnezzar, he's seen Amon-Marduk, he's seen those other two guys that I can't pronounce, Labrador and whoever the other guy was. He's seen all that come and go, right? But he also indicts Belshazzar for allowing the vessels of the temple to be dishonored by using them in a way they were never intended to be used. I can only draw from this that this is the first time that they were used this way. I can't, it's got to be. Or else God would have acted before then. Finally, he chastises Belshazzar for giving praise to idols who are unable to see, hear, or understand. When you think about it in that light, you might think about how ridiculous it was for the Babylonians to be giving praise to little statues, to little bits of wood, to little bits of gold or silver that can't hear or respond or understand. Now, I gave you some passages there. I'll just read one. I'll read the Isaiah 40. I didn't quote it in your notes, but let me just read it for you. Isaiah chapter 40, verses 18 through 26 is quite telling. This is Isaiah recounting the greatness of God, and he says, "To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare with him?" It's verse 18. Now verse 19. "As for the idol, a craftsman casts it, a goldsmith plates it with gold, and a silversmith fashions chains of silver. He who is too impoverished for such an offering selects a tree that is not wrought. He seeks out for himself a skillful craftsman to prepare an idol that will not totter. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is He, Yahweh, who sits above the circle of the earth." And that compares him to the size of these idols. He sits above the horizon, the circle of the earth, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He it is who reduces rulers to nothing, who makes the judges of the earth meaningless. Scarcely have they been planted, scarcely have they been sown, scarcely has their stock taken root in the earth, but he merely blows on them and they wither, and the storm carries them away like stubble. To whom then will you liken me, that I would be his equal, says the Holy One. Lift your eyes up on high and see who has created these stars, the one who leads forth their host by number. He calls them all by name, because of the greatness of his might and the strength of his power. Not one of them is missing. So just in comparison to the little idols that were made, that they were giving worship and praise to, God is incomparable, beyond compare. Now, the next, in verse 23, it says, "But the God in whose hand are your life breath, and all your ways you have not glorified." The reference to hand there is meant to be power. The God in whose power is your life breath. But I can't help thinking the mention of the hand of the Most High would not be lost given the events of the recent past. The hand writing on the wall. Life breath indicates the breath or the spirit that animates and makes a person alive. God breathed into Adam the breath of life. That's what he means there by life breath. Verse 24, now Daniel makes the connection to God's activity in sending the hand which wrote the message that so terrified Belshazzar. Then the hand was sent from him and his inscription was written out. One thing to keep in mind is that Daniel had received, I mentioned this before, specific visions during the years of the reign of Belshazzar. And we'll get to those when we get to 7 and 8. But these visions served as confirmation to the visions that Daniel, what Daniel sees here in this handwriting is confirmation of the visions that he's already received in the past. Right? So remind me, if I don't draw your attention to that in chapters 7 and 8, remind me of that. So here's what's written on the wall and what it means. Verse 25, the complete message. And I gave you the pronunciation in case you wanted to go home and wow your friends with this. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. That's the message. That's the complete handwriting that was on the wall. And the meaning, in verse 26 through 28, he gives the meanings of each of those. Mene means numbered. In other words, your number's up. Your number's been called. Your days are numbered. Any kind of like that you want to put. But in Aramaic, the word means a mina, which is a monetary unit of 60 shekels. Just fun facts for you to know and tell. Daniel interprets it, though. He interprets it for us as he says in verse 26, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. You're done. And he says it twice. You're done, you're done. Tekel means weighed and found light. Weighed and found light or lacking. In Aramaic, the word means a shekel. Scales were used in the marketplace and other areas as a means of establishing integrity in the exchange of goods or currency. So a weight standard was established. This is how much a shekel ought to weigh, and they put it on one side of the scale. And then whatever the person was trying to pay with, they would put it on the other side. And if it ended up being lighter than the shekel, well, then they would have to add more shekels. They would have to add more worth to the transaction. See, that's what it meant. So Daniel interprets it as you've been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Belshazzar is not measured up to the standard of one who's been placed under God's authority. And then this changes. If you notice, it's in verse 28, it's Peres. But remember, the original writing was Upharsin. So what's up with that? Well, Peres means divided, is what it means. Now, in Aramaic, the word means half pieces or half shekels. But this word is different, as I mentioned, than in verse 25. The U on Upharsin simply means the word and. So if you put it all together, it means your days are numbered, and you've been found lacking, and your kingdom will be divided. So it's just the word, the U is and the IN on the end is the plural form. So if you take that out, if you take the U and the IN out, you're left with really three Aramaic consonants, P, R, and S. And so really it's just putting in the vowel sounds in there that really, what really men have done. It's the same root, just a different form. And so Daniel interprets it as your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. So Daniel gives him the interpretation of this. So putting it all together, numbered, too light, divided. That's what it all means. Something else, though, just for kicks on the next page. Did you notice that Upharsin and Peres kind of look and sound like Persia? I don't think that's an accident. I think Daniel interpreted it that way for us, but even in the word, you could see Persia, right? Now, while all this is happening, there are events unfolding outside the city walls. We've just been looking inside the banquet hall for a while, but I have to look outside the city of Babylon. And Herodotus, citing Herodotus, John MacArthur writes, the Medes and the Persians are outside the city. And the night in which Belshazzar had his feast, and by the way, the night is marked for all history, 16th day of Tishri, 539 BC, that would be in October, around the 11th or 12th of that year by our months. That night the Medes and the Persians built a dam on the Euphrates, and it flowed under the wall of the city, and they diverted all of that water coming into the Euphrates, except a little shallow portion. They diverted it into swampland. And when the water began to fall in the midst of the banquet, it came down to about the knees or the waist of the soldiers. They marched underneath the wall on that shallow riverbed and went into the inside, killed the guards, threw open the gates, and the whole Medo-Persian army descended on that city in one fell swoop. So he thought he was protected, indefensible. Defensible, is that right? Beyond defeat. And yet the Medo-Persians figured out a way in. So that's what we know happened outside the city walls while this is taking place. And now the last three verses, the conclusion here. Then Belshazzar, verse 29, Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. And then, almost like a dramatic shift in the account, that same night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Three random statements. Just we're going to tie up all the loose ends here in this chapter. So even though Daniel had refused these honors, in a surprising turn of events, Belshazzar gives him the purple clothing, the gold necklace, the appointment of the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel now at this point has arisen further than he ever has in Babylon. He is a co-regent along with Nabonidus and Belshazzar, at least for a few minutes, before the Medo-Persians come in. And although he refused these gifts earlier, scholars are unable to really all agree on why he receives them now. So here's some of the reasons that are given. One, now that he's given the interpretation with no expectation of reward, no evidence of a bribe remains, and he can receive it. That's one explanation. Two, he knows that it's an empty offer, since he has his very own prediction was that Belshazzar's reign and therefore his edicts would not last. So he said, yeah, you can put this on me. It doesn't mean anything, is the second reason. Or the third, the fact that the king commands them makes them irrefutable. And what good would it do Daniel to refuse them at this point, except to make a show or make a spectacle of it? So those are the three reasons, but no scholar agree. There's not a company of scholars that agree on one of these three. Pick a scholar, they'll pick a different one or maybe something else. So, all right, so verse 30, Belshazzar's reign did not even last the rest of the night. And then verse 31, Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. As the timeline states, remember Cyrus was king of Persia, right? King of the Medo-Persian Empire. I think it's significant that the Bible states that Darius received the kingdom. He didn't take it by force. In other words, it wasn't his to take. It was Cyrus. So I think this supports that Darius was a provincial ruler while Cyrus was the king. So Darius is the one we'll see next week when we deal with Daniel and the lion's den. But one other interesting little tidbit, one scholar brought this out, and I don't think you make too much of it, make of it what you will, but if the handwriting on the wall was interpreted according to the Aramaic, all of those were monetary figures. A mina, shekel, half shekel, divided, shekel divided. Remember that the mina represented 60 shekels. And then there was shekel, I'm going to get all the math wrong here, but anyway, the number of the shekels would have been 62, which would have been the age of Darius when he received the kingdom. And that's why the Bible goes to the little detail of adding at the age of 62. Make of it what you will. It's not important in the grand scheme of things, but just one of those little fun facts to know and tell. Questions, comments?
Did you ever, I don't know if you ever listened to David Jeremiah sermons. He did a series on Daniel several years ago, and he said that his favorite pronunciation of what was written on the wall was "money, money tickles parson."
Oh, that's good. Did y'all hear what she said? David Jeremiah, in his series on Daniel, he said his favorite pronunciation of that message in verse 23, verse 25 was "money, money tickles the parson." Parson being a minister, money, money.
I have a question. If it was wrote in Aramaic, wouldn't they have been able to read it?
That's a good question, and that's why some scholars think that only the king and Daniel could see it. That's where they get that from. That
Or maybe it was written in something else.
maybe so, or maybe they were just a letter that represented each one, and Daniel's the one who actually provided the interpretation of the whole thing. Maybe it was just a part of a word or a part of a letter. So
If it was written in Hebrew, would they have been able to read it? Because
I don't know.
Remember that when in the very beginning you said that they were kind of being indoctrinated to
Aramaic.
into the Babylonian.
Yeah, which would have been
language.
Aramaic. Yeah.
So I don't think that.
As far as I know, these aren't Hebrew words. I didn't read any scholar that thought they were in Hebrew. The best result or conclusion that I could make is that God made it understandable to only Daniel. That's the only way I know it. I mean, and that's not out of the box. I mean, God made it to where Daniel was the only one who understood it.
You wrote it in English.
You read it in English. Yeah. That would really be forward-looking, wouldn't it? Good question, though. Any other questions or comments?
Well, I have a comment.
Okay.
My brain was going crazy.
Oh.
Like, how do you get 62, right?
Yeah.
Doing
Did you
the
figure it
math.
out?
I think I figured it out.
I'm glad you did, Ross.
So, my app here says that a mina is 50 shekels.
Ah.
So if you go 50, 50, 25, 125 divided by 2 is 62.
Oh, well, there you go. Thank you, Ross.
Okay.
Got
So
that figured out for us.
Math ain't nothing, you know?
Ross Travis, ladies and gentlemen. Very good. Yes. All right. Thank you, Ross. Good. Because I knew my math was not working there at the end, and I was just taking a scholar's word for it, really, at that point. All right. Any other questions, comments?
The thing
James?
where Daniel accepts the necklace and the robe, I mean, to me, it's like a non-issue. If a king makes a proclamation, it doesn't matter whether you accept it or not. It's the same as, who was it?
Excuse me.
The guy that cut off John the Baptist's head.
Yeah, Herod the Great,
He
yeah.
said, I'll give you whatever you want up to half a kingdom. He had to fulfill it.
Right.
Because he said it,
Right.
you know. Once it's out there, you
Can't take it back, yeah.
can't.
So for those of you online, what James is saying is that the whole thing of Daniel taking the robe and the necklace and everything was, it's a non-issue, because once the king had made the proclamation, it was out there, it was going to happen. I mean, there's not really any point in, refusing at that point.
But they refuse for their stuff, like worshiping the other gods.
Yeah, but that's not something tangible. That's something that they couldn't control. The king couldn't make him bow down and worship. He'd have to kill him. But these are tangible, presentations of things. And I think all of Daniel knows it's meaningless anyway. Again, the real authority comes from God, not from a robe or a necklace or any title. He knows. He's affirmed in his belief. The real authority comes from God.
If he knows they're about to be wiped out.
And he knows they're about to be wiped out. Yeah. All right. Okay, that's it for chapter 5.